The morning of September 1st, 1943 broke clear over Marcus Island, a speck of coral and volcanic rock sitting alone in the vast Pacific, 1,150 miles southeast of Tokyo. Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch O'Hare banked his F6F Hellcat into position at 22,000 feet, the Pratt and Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine humming with 2,000 horses of raw power beneath his feet. Below him, the island's Japanese installations looked like toys scattered across a sandbox. Above him, nothing but empty sky and the tactical advantage that altitude provided. O'Hare had logged more combat hours than most pilots would see in a lifetime. Medal of Honor recipient. 5 confirmed kills already to his name. He'd survived when better men hadn't, and he'd learned the one lesson that the Pacific War taught without mercy. The pilot who controls the vertical dimension controls the fight. His division of 8 Hellcats from VF9 held formation with practiced discipline. They'd launched from USS Essex an hour earlier, as part of a larger strike package testing Japanese defences. Intelligence suggested Marcus Island hosted a modest fighter garrison, mostly Mitsubishi A6M0s. Standard doctrine applied. Maintain altitude, observe, engage, only when conditions favoured the Americans. O'Hare scanned the sky with methodical sweeps, left to right, checking his 6, then forward again. The Japanese would come. They always did when American aircraft appeared over their territory. The question wasn't if, but when and from what angle. The radio crackled with traffic from other elements of the strike force. Dive bombers were setting up their runs. Torpedo planes were circling, waiting for fighter escorts to clear the airspace. The ballet of carrier aviation unfolded with choreographed precision, each element depending on the others to perform their role correctly. O'Hare's role was simple. Kill enemy fighters before they could threaten the strike aircraft, kill them efficiently, kill them without losses, and if possible, learn something new about this unfamiliar aircraft underneath him. The Hellcat was only 2 months into its combat deployment. VF9 had been flying them since January, but this was their first major engagement. O'Hare had studied every technical specification Grumman provided. The numbers looked impressive on paper. Maximum speed of 380 miles per hour, climb rate of 3,410 feet per minute with the later F6F variant that some pilots were already flying, combat radius of 820 nautical miles, 650 caliber Browning machine guns with 400 rounds per gun, self-sealing fuel tanks, armor plating behind the pilot. The Hellcat weighed 15,413 pounds fully loaded for combat, nearly 3 times the weight of a Zero. It should have been a sluggish pig. Instead, it handled like nothing O'Hare had ever flown. What mattered most to O'Hare was the climb performance. The engineering reports stated the F6F could sustain 2,600 feet per minute at sea level, increasing with proper technique at optimal altitude. The newer F6F models being tested pushed that number beyond 3,400 feet per minute. Compare that to his old Wildcat's 2,300 feet per minute, and you understood the revolution Grumman had achieved. More importantly, compare it to the Zero's documented climb rate of 2,812 feet per minute, and you realized the Hellcat could match or exceed Japanese performance in the one domain that mattered most, the vertical. For 2 years, American pilots in the Pacific had fought with their hands tied. The Zeros dominated through superior maneuverability, outturning everything the United States threw at them. The F4F Wildcat was a tough, reliable fighter, but it couldn't climb with a Zero. It couldn't catch a Zero that chose to disengage. Wildcat pilots survived through tactics, Jimmy Thatch's weave, boom and zoom attacks, energy management. They survived through discipline and training, and the sheer bloody-minded refusal to turn with an enemy that could turn tighter. But survival wasn't victory. Survival meant Japanese pilots still controlled when to fight and when to flee. The Hellcat changed that equation fundamentally. For the first time, American carrier pilots could dictate terms of engagement. A Zero, attempting to climb away from a diving Hellcat, would find the American aircraft matching his climb, maintaining separation, even closing distance if the Hellcat pilot managed his energy correctly. The hunter and the hunted had switched roles, and most Japanese pilots didn't know it yet. O'Hare's tactical doctrine for this engagement was clear. Exploit the vertical. When contact occurred, maintain altitude superiority. Make high-speed, diving passes. Use the Hellcat's climb rate to zoom back to altitude before Zeros could react. Never turn with the enemy. Never give them the fight their aircraft was designed for. Force them to fight American style. Fast, vertical, brutal. At 09:28 hours, the contact came. O'Hare spotted them first. 6 dots climbing from the direction of Marcus Island's airfield. Zeros, almost certainly, though at this distance, visual identification remained tentative. They were lower, maybe 18,000 feet, clawing for altitude to intercept the American strike package. O'Hare keyed his radio. Vampires climbing from the island. 6 bogies, Angels 18, heading our way. The American formation maintained discipline. No one dove immediately. They held altitude, let the Japanese climb toward them, bleeding energy in the ascent. This was the trap Japanese pilots had used successfully for 2 years. Appear below the enemy, draw them into a dive, then use superior turning ability to reverse the engagement. O'Hare wasn't taking that bait. His Hellcats would wait, observe, and strike only when geometry favored them completely. The Zeros continued climbing. 19,000 feet, 20,000 feet. Their rate of ascent was impressive, exactly what intelligence reports had indicated. At 21,000 feet, they leveled off, apparently content to patrol between the Americans and the strike aircraft below. Standard defensive posture. The Japanese commander was playing it safe, maintaining position rather than committing to a full-throttle climb to engage. O'Hare smiled behind his oxygen mask. The Japanese had just made their first mistake. They'd conceded the altitude advantage. They'd positioned themselves exactly where American doctrine wanted them, below, with American fighters holding the energy reserve that altitude provided. He rolled his Hellcat into a gentle turn, positioning for a diving attack. His wingman stuck to him like glue. The section leaders maintained their positions, each pair ready to support the others. No one would be caught alone. No one would be forced into the turning fight that killed Wildcat pilots. Skipper's got the lead. O'Hare transmitted. We're going down. Follow me through, extend and climb. No turning back. He pushed the nose over and opened the throttle. The Hellcat responded immediately, accelerating in the dive with authority that the Wildcat never possessed. Airspeed climbed, 300 miles per hour, 320, 340. The Zero formation grew larger in his windscreen. They'd spotted the diving Americans now, breaking formation, some turning toward the threat, others maintaining position. Confusion was visible even from 2,000 feet above them. They didn't know whether to climb to meet the attack or turn to evade. O'Hare picked his target, a Zero attempting to climb toward him. Bad decision. The Japanese pilot had committed to meeting the Americans, but head-on, rather than diving away to maintain speed. At 1,000 feet separation, O'Hare centered the illuminated reticle of his Mark 8 reflector gun sight on the Zero's nose. The combined closure rate exceeded 600 miles per hour. He had maybe 2 seconds. He squeezed the trigger. 6 .50 caliber Browning machine guns erupted, the recoil pushing against the Hellcat's forward momentum but not significantly. Tracer rounds walked into the Zero, impacts visible along the wing root and fuselage. The Japanese fighter shuddered, pieces separating from the airframe, then rolled inverted and fell away burning. O'Hare didn't watch. His eyes were already on the airspeed indicator and altimeter. He pulled back on the stick, converting dive speed into a climbing zoom. The Hellcat's nose pointed skyward, climbing at a steep angle. This was the critical moment. This was where Wildcat pilots had died, trying to zoom climb and finding Zeros overtaking them from behind. Superior climb. rate letting Japanese pilots reverse the situation. The Hellcat climbed 19,000 feet, 20,000, 21,000. O'Hare glanced back over his shoulder. A Zero had attempted pursuit, following him into the climb. But something was wrong with the Japanese pilot's attack. The Zero was falling behind, not dramatically, but measurably. The Hellcat was outclimbing him. O'Hare maintained his zoom for another 1,000 feet, watching the Zero struggle, watching the Japanese pilot realize his aircraft couldn't match the American's vertical performance. At 22,000 feet, O'Hare leveled off, still maintaining 200 knots of airspeed. The Zero below him had given up the chase, rolling away to dive back toward the melee developing around the main formation. O'Hare's wingman joined him, having executed an identical attack profile with identical results. Below them, the other Hellcat sections were making their passes, diving through the Zero formation, firing, then climbing away before Japanese pilots could respond. The engagement lasted 8 minutes. When O'Hare led his division back toward the Essex, they'd shot down 3 Zeros confirmed, damaged 2 others, and suffered exactly 0 losses. The Hellcat had passed its first real combat test. But more importantly, something else had happened during those 8 minutes, something that would ripple through Japanese naval aviation with profound consequences. The Zero pilots who survived the engagement returned to Marcus Island with detailed combat reports. They described the new American fighters' capabilities. Heavy firepower, rugged construction, respectable speed. But one characteristic dominated their debriefs. The new American fighter could climb. Not just climb adequately, but climb in ways that matched or exceeded the Zero's performance. When American pilots zoomed away after attack runs, Zeros couldn't catch them. When Zeros attempted to climb to engagement altitude, Americans was already higher. The vertical dimension, where Japanese fighters had held uncontested superiority for 2 years, had been neutralized. Those combat reports made their way through Japanese Naval Aviation Command with deliberate speed. By mid-September 1943, intelligence officers in Tokyo were compiling data from multiple encounters with the new American fighter. The aircraft was identified as the Grumman F6F, designated by American pilots as the Hellcat. Early encounters near Marcus Island, Tarawa, and Rabaul painted a consistent picture. American tactics had shifted. Pilots were refusing turning engagements entirely, fighting exclusively in the vertical plane, and they were winning. On September 18, 1943, a tactical directive circulated through Japanese naval fighter units in the Central and South Pacific. The document, later captured by American intelligence and translated, contained explicit warnings. Translation: the new Grumman fighter demonstrates climb performance equal to Type 0. Pilots should avoid extended vertical maneuvering when engaged by this aircraft. Recommend drawing American fighters into low-altitude horizontal combat, where Type 0 advantages remain relevant. That directive represented something unprecedented in the Pacific Air War. For 2 years, Japanese tactical doctrine had been offensive, aggressive, built on confidence in equipment superiority. Now, headquarters was telling pilots to avoid specific types of combat against specific American aircraft. That wasn't adaptation. That was acknowledgement of inferiority. But directives from headquarters were one thing. Changing ingrained habits was another. Japanese naval aviation had built its entire tactical philosophy around maneuverability and climb performance. Pilots trained for years to exploit those advantages. They'd achieved staggering success using those tactics. Telling them to suddenly fight defensively, to avoid the vertical combat they'd mastered, was like telling a swordsman to fight left-handed. The Zero itself complicated adaptation. The Mitsubishi A6M was a masterpiece of lightweight engineering, designed when maneuverability mattered most. At 6,025 pounds maximum takeoff weight, it was less than half the Hellcat's weight. That lightness gave it a 16-second turn radius at 230 knots, unmatched by any American fighter. But lightness came with trade-offs. No armor plating, no self-sealing fuel tanks. Minimal structural reinforcement. The Zero was built to win through not being hit. When hit, it burned. The engine made the problem worse. The Nakajima NK-1C Sakai 21 produced 1,130 horsepower, respectable for its displacement, but inadequate against the Hellcat's 2,000 horsepower double Wasp. The power-to-weight ratio told the story. The Zero achieved 2.49 kilograms per horsepower. The Hellcat managed 2.8 kilograms per horsepower. That narrow difference, combined with the Hellcat's superior engine power at altitude where superchargers mattered, translated to climb performance that Japanese pilots couldn't overcome through skill alone. By October 1943, Hellcats were spreading across the Pacific carrier fleet. VF-1, VF-2, VF-5, VF-6, and VF-9 all transitioned to the new fighter. Each squadron brought back similar reports after their first engagements. Japanese pilots were probing, testing, trying to understand this new opponent's capabilities and limitations. Every combat produced more data for both sides, but Americans held the advantage. They knew their aircraft's capabilities and were developing tactics specifically designed to exploit them. The intelligence advantage extended beyond simple performance data. American signals intelligence had been reading Japanese naval communications since before the war through code-breaking efforts designated MAGIC. By late 1943, these intercepts provided real-time insight into how Japanese naval aviation was responding to the Hellcat threat. What Allied intelligence officers discovered confirmed what American pilots suspected. The Japanese High Command was issuing explicit tactical warnings about engaging Hellcats in vertical combat. Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, based at Pearl Harbor, employed Japanese linguists who translated intercepts in near real time. One transmission from November 1943, recorded during an engagement near Rabaul, captured a Japanese flight leader warning his wingmen. The translation read, "New American fighter climbs like our own. Do not follow into vertical. Maintain energy and disengage." The term, maintain energy, was particularly significant because it showed Japanese pilots understood the physics of the problem. They simply lacked aircraft capable of solving it. More revealing were formal tactical directives intercepted from Japanese Naval Aviation Headquarters. A December 1943 bulletin issued to units in the Central Pacific explicitly warned pilots about the Grumman fighter's vertical performance. The document stated that the new American fighter possessed climbing ability equal to or exceeding the Type 0, and recommended pilots avoid prolonged vertical maneuvering when engaged. The directive suggested instead that pilots should attempt to draw American fighters into low-altitude horizontal maneuvering combat, where zero advantages might still apply. Commander Joseph Rochefort's intelligence team at Pearl Harbor compiled these intercepts into tactical summaries distributed to carrier air groups. American squadron commanders read them during pre-mission briefings, and pilots found validation in knowing their tactics were working exactly as intended. The Japanese weren't just being beaten. They were being beaten so consistently that their own command structure was warning pilots to avoid specific types of combat. That kind of tactical directive revealed desperation. By December 1943, engagement after engagement confirmed the pattern. American fighters refused horizontal combat, maintained altitude discipline, and exploited vertical superiority systematically. Japanese after-action reports increasingly mentioned American fighters that refused combat or withdrew upward when approached, which was Japanese interpretation of American vertical fighting. But these weren't withdrawals. They were tactical repositioning moves that consistently resulted in American advantages and Japanese losses. The stage was set for systematic exploitation. American squadron commanders recognized they had a weapon that fundamentally changed Pacific air combat. The Hellcat's climb rate wasn't just a performance statistic. It was a tactical advantage that invalidated decades of Japanese fighter doctrine. Commander David McCampbell, who would become the Navy's top ace with 34 confirmed kills, described it perfectly during squadron briefings. We don't fight their fight anymore. We make them fight ours. And our fight happens in the vertical. The numbers told the story with brutal clarity. A Hellcat at sea level could reach 10,000 feet in approximately 3 minutes and 50 seconds of sustained climbing, while maintaining an airspeed of 160 knots. A Zero attempting the same climb would arrive seconds later, but with lower remaining airspeed, meaning less energy for maneuvering. Those seconds translated to positional advantage, and position was everything in air combat. The American pilot reached altitude first, could observe the developing situation, and could choose whether to engage or climb higher still. Squadron training throughout late 1943 hammered these concepts into every Hellcat pilot. The tactical doctrine was called fast and high, and it required discipline that didn't come naturally to aggressive young aviators. When a Zero appeared below you, every instinct screamed to dive immediately and engage. But the doctrine demanded patience, maintain altitude, observe the enemy's energy state, wait for the optimal moment, then dive with tremendous speed. Make your firing pass. And the critical part, resist the temptation to turn and chase. Instead, use that diving speed to climb back to altitude, extending away from the enemy while regaining your positional advantage. Japanese pilots found themselves in an impossible situation. Their training emphasized turning combat, where the Zero's 16-second turn radius at 230 knots gave them superiority over nearly every opponent they'd faced. But Hellcat pilots simply wouldn't turn. A Zero pilot might execute a perfect reversal, pulling his aircraft through a gut-wrenching turn that would make any pre-war instructor proud, only to find his target already 1,000 feet above him and climbing away. Pursuing meant bleeding energy in, a climb where the American held the advantage. Not pursuing meant conceding the initiative entirely. The vertical trap worked because it forced Japanese pilots to make losing choices, engage in the climb and accept inferior performance, or maintain altitude and allow Americans to dictate engagement timing. Some experienced Japanese pilots adapted by trying to stay above American formations, but Hellcats could be prepositioned at altitude specifically to counter this. Combat air patrols now stationed themselves at 20,000 to 25,000 feet, altitudes where the Hellcat's two-stage supercharged engine still delivered strong performance, while Japanese engines struggled with thin air. Lieutenant Alexander Vratsiu, who flew with VF-16 and would finish the war with 19 confirmed kills, explained the psychological impact during post-war interviews. Japanese pilots had spent 2 years controlling the terms of engagement. They chose when to fight based on positional advantage. Now that control shifted entirely to American pilots. Vratsiu described encounters where Zero pilots would attempt aggressive head-on passes, hoping to score quick kills, then break away and dive to escape rather than risk climbing combat. The hunted had become the hunters. The mathematics of energy management underpinned everything. When a fighter climbs, it trades kinetic energy for potential energy, converting speed into altitude. The rate at which an aircraft can make this conversion while maintaining controllability defines its vertical performance. The Hellcat's power-to-weight ratio, combined with its efficient wing design, meant it could sustain this conversion longer and more effectively than the Zero. A Hellcat pilot who started a climb with 300 knots of airspeed could reach 15,000 feet while maintaining enough speed to maneuver. A Zero pilot attempting the same climb would arrive slower, more vulnerable, and out of position. June 19, 1944 dawned clear over the Philippine Sea, and what followed would become the most lopsided aerial victory in naval aviation history. The battle that pilots would forever call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was about to validate everything American carrier aviation had built toward for 2 years. Task Force 58, commanded by Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, deployed 15 carriers with 956 aircraft, including 475 Hellcats. Opposing them, Vice Admiral Jizaburo Ozawa's mobile fleet launched waves of aircraft from 9 carriers, determined to destroy the American invasion force off Saipan. The Japanese plan relied on shuttle bombing tactics where aircraft would strike American ships, land at Guam or other Mariana airfields to refuel and rearm, then strike again on the return flight. It was an elegant concept that maximized their aircraft's range advantage. But the plan assumed Japanese pilots could fight their way through American combat air patrols, and that assumption would prove catastrophically wrong. American radar detected the first incoming raid at 1000 hours at a distance of 150 miles, giving Hellcat pilots time to climb to optimal interception altitude. Commander David McCampbell, leading the Essex Air Group, positioned his Hellcats at 25,000 feet, more than 4 miles above the ocean. When Japanese formations appeared below at 18,000 to 20,000 feet, American pilots held every advantage. They had altitude, they had radar vectors providing perfect positioning, and they had aircraft that could dictate the terms of engagement. McCampbell's famous transmission, "All guns, this is base, Vector 270, climb to Angels 25, sent Hellcats streaming toward the incoming threat with disciplined precision. The first wave of 69 Japanese aircraft hit American defenses like water against a dam. Hellcats dove from altitude, ripped, through the formations with devastating gunnery passes, then climbed back to altitude while Japanese pilots tried desperately to respond. Zero pilots, who attempted to climb after their attackers, found themselves exactly where American doctrine wanted them, low on energy, vulnerable, and unable to catch their tormentors. Those who dove away to maintain speed simply took themselves out of the fight, unable to threaten American ships, while Hellcats controlled the altitudes above. Lieutenant Alexander Vrasiu, flying from the Lexington, intercepted a formation of 50 Japanese dive bombers with minimal fighter escort. In a single engagement lasting 8 minutes, he shot down 6 aircraft, demonstrating the Hellcat's devastating effectiveness when properly employed. His tactical report described how he used altitude advantage to make repeated diving attacks, climbing away after each pass, while Japanese fighters struggled to respond. He never allowed himself to be drawn into turn combat, never gave his opponents the fight they'd trained for. The second Japanese wave of 130 aircraft fared no better. American fighter directors, watching radar plots, vectored fresh Hellcat squadrons into perfect interception positions. The Japanese formation fragmented under constant attacks from above. Pilots who tried to maintain formation discipline became predictable targets. Those who broke formation to engage individually lost mutual support and fell to coordinated American tactics. The vertical advantage meant American pilots could observe the entire battle developing below them, choosing targets and timing attacks for maximum effect. Wave 3 consisted of 47 aircraft, and Wave 4 numbered 82. Both met the same systematic destruction. By the end of June 19th, Japanese naval aviation had lost approximately 346 carrier aircraft. American losses totaled 29 aircraft, with most falling to anti-aircraft fire rather than aerial combat. The kill ratio exceeded 10-1, and several Hellcat pilots achieved ace status in a single day. Ensign Wilbur Spider Webb shot down 6 aircraft. Lieutenant Junior Grade William Bill Stewart claimed 5. The names went on and on. June 20th brought a desperate Japanese retreat and an aggressive American pursuit. As Japanese carriers fled westward, American strikes launched at maximum range, knowing pilots would face nighttime carrier recoveries after exhausting their fuel. Hellcats escorted the strike packages, and when Japanese combat air patrol rose to intercept, American fighters used their now familiar vertical tactics. Japanese pilots, already demoralized and exhausted, broke off combat rather than accept engagements they knew they couldn't win. The 2-day battle cost Japan over 600 aircraft and 3 carriers sunk. American carrier aviation had achieved absolute air superiority, and the Hellcat's vertical performance was the blade that cut Japanese resistance to pieces. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot wasn't just a tactical victory. It was the systematic application of doctrine built specifically to exploit American technical advantages against Japanese weaknesses. The climb rate wasn't just a number in a specification sheet, It was the foundation of a tactical revolution that ended Japanese naval aviation as an effective fighting force. Japanese naval aviation recognized the problem, but found themselves trapped by circumstances beyond their control. The warnings circulated, the tactical directives were issued, and experienced pilots understood they faced an opponent with superior vertical performance. But knowing you're outmatched and fixing the problem are entirely different challenges, especially when your industrial base is crumbling under Allied bombing and your pilot training pipeline has been devastated by 2 years of attrition. The most obvious solution would have been developing a new fighter to counter the Hellcat's capabilities. Japan did produce the Mitsubishi J-2M Raiden and Kawanishi N-1K-1 Shiden, both of which offered improved performance over the Zero. The Raiden could climb at 3,000 feet per minute and reach 380 miles per hour, numbers that finally matched American fighters. But production problems plagued both designs. The Raiden suffered engine reliability issues throughout its service life, with the Mitsubishi Kasei engine proving temperamental and prone to overheating. Only 476 were built during the entire war. The Shiden faced different problems despite being an excellent aircraft on paper. It was adapted from the Kawanishi N-1K floatplane fighter, inheriting a complex landing gear design that caused maintenance nightmares. The aircraft didn't reach operational units until early 1944, and production never exceeded 1,400 units total. Even when these superior fighters reached frontline squadrons, pilot quality had degraded so severely that the aircraft's capabilities couldn't be fully exploited. A talented pilot in a Zero was more effective than a mediocre pilot in a theoretically superior Shiden. The training pipeline collapse was killing Japanese naval aviation more surely than any combat loss. Pre-war Japanese pilot training was extraordinarily thorough, requiring 300 to 700 flight hours before a pilot joined an operational squadron. These men were elite aviators by any standard, but combat consumed them faster than the training system could replace them. By mid-1944, new Japanese pilots arrived at squadrons with 100 to 150 flight hours total, and some had as few as 40 hours. These barely trained aviators faced American pilots who averaged 300 flight hours, plus extensive gunnery and tactical training. Doctrine couldn't adapt fast enough either. The vertical fighting directives, distributed throughout the fleet, required skills that novice pilots simply didn't possess. Energy management, the ability to judge your aircraft's energy state and your opponent's energy state simultaneously while under combat stress, took extensive training to master. American pilots drilled these concepts repeatedly in stateside training squadrons. Japanese pilots were rushed through abbreviated training, shoved into cockpits, and expected to survive against vastly more experienced opponents flying superior aircraft. Some experienced Japanese pilots did adapt individually. Warrant Officer Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's top aces, described in his memoir how he modified his tactics after encountering Hellcats. He avoided climbing combat entirely, instead using hit-and-run attacks from favorable positions and immediately disengaging before American fighters could respond. But Sakai was exceptional, a survivor with over 500 combat missions. His tactics required judgment and skill that new pilots couldn't replicate. One veteran could adapt, but squadrons full of novices couldn't. The strategic situation made everything worse. By late 1944, Japan was fighting defensively across a contracting perimeter. Japanese fighters were forced into combat, protecting critical installations, shipping, and homeland approaches. They couldn't choose favorable engagement conditions because they had to defend fixed locations. American carrier task forces, by contrast, attacked when and where they chose, always with numerical superiority, and always with the option to disengage if conditions turned unfavorable. Fuel shortages compounded every problem. Advanced pilot training requires fuel for flight hours. Japan's synthetic fuel production and dwindling petroleum imports meant training was cut even shorter. Operational squadrons received reduced fuel allocations, limiting their ability to maintain proficiency through practice. Some units couldn't afford training, flights at all, meaning pilots only flew during actual combat missions. You cannot maintain edge-of-envelope skills, the kind of high-energy maneuvering required to exploit or counter vertical tactics, without regular practice. The final problem was psychological. Japanese naval aviation culture emphasized aggressive offensive spirit, the concept of seishin or fighting spirit. Tactical directives telling pilots to avoid certain types of combat contradicted deeply ingrained cultural values. Some pilots felt that refusing vertical combat was cowardly, that proper fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantage. This cultural resistance to defensive tactics meant some pilots ignored the warnings entirely and engaged Hellcats in exactly the vertical combat they'd been told to avoid. They died maintaining their honor, but they still died, and their deaths accomplished nothing except adding to the kill tallies of American aces. When the last guns fell silent over Tokyo Bay in September 1945, the Grumman F6F Hellcat's combat record stood as one of the most dominant performances in aviation history. The numbers were staggering and almost beyond belief. 5,156 enemy aircraft destroyed in aerial combat, 209 additional aircraft destroyed on the ground, all achieved at a loss of approximately 270 Hellcats in air-to-air combat. That 19-to-1 kill ratio represented the most lopsided aerial victory margin of any major fighter aircraft in the Second World War. No other fighter, not the Spitfire, not the Mustang, not the Messerschmitt 109, achieved anything comparable. The climb rate advantage was the fundamental factor underlying this dominance. Every other advantage, the heavy armament, the rugged construction, the pilot armor, mattered tremendously. But the ability to control the vertical dimension of combat made everything else possible. American pilots could choose when to engage and when to extend away. They could position themselves above threats and dive with decisive speed advantage. They could escape unfavorable situations by climbing to altitudes where pursuing aircraft couldn't follow effectively. This flexibility was unprecedented in Pacific carrier operations. Individual pilot achievements illustrated the Hellcat's effectiveness. Captain David McCampbell's 34 confirmed kills made him the Navy's top ace. Commander Cecil Harris finished with 24 victories, all in Hellcats. Lieutenant Eugene Valencia developed the mowing machine tactical formation, pairing fighters in mutually supporting elements that exploited vertical tactics to devastating effect, and finished with 23 kills. These weren't just talented pilots. They were tacticians who understood how to extract maximum effectiveness from their aircraft's capabilities. The Hellcat's operational versatility extended beyond pure air superiority. The F6F5N Knight fighter variant, equipped with AN/APS-6 radar in a fairing on the starboard wing, hunted Japanese aircraft in darkness when previous night fighter attempts had proven inadequate. These aircraft destroyed 254 Japanese planes at night, providing 24-hour air defense for carrier task forces. The F6F5 could carry 2,000 pounds of bombs, or 6 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, making it an effective ground attack platform. Some Hellcats operated as photo reconnaissance aircraft, with cameras replacing guns. The basic airframe strength and reliability made all these roles possible. Production numbers reflected the Hellcat's strategic importance. Grumman's Bethpage facility produced 12,275 F6F Hellcats between 1942 and November 1945, when production ended just weeks after Japan's surrender. At peak production in March 1945, the factory delivered 605 aircraft in a single month, an average of more than 20 Hellcats per day. This industrial achievement meant American carriers never lacked aircraft regardless of combat losses. Every damaged Hellcat could be replaced within weeks, sometimes days. Japanese factories, by contrast, struggled to replace losses at all. The Hellcat's design philosophy influenced post-war American fighter development profoundly. The emphasis on vertical performance, energy management, and boom and zoom tactics became foundational concepts for jet fighter design. The Korean War's F-9F Panthers and F-2H Banshees were essentially jet-powered applications of Hellcat combat doctrine. Even modern fighter tactics still emphasize energy management and vertical maneuvering, concepts that Hellcat pilots refined into systematic doctrine during the Pacific War. Foreign operators used Hellcats extensively during and after the war. Britain's Fleet Air Arm received 1,182 Hellcats, under Lend-Lease, operating them from escort carriers in the Atlantic and Pacific. The French Aéronavale flew Hellcats during the Indochina War. Uruguay's Navy operated them until 1960, making the Hellcat one of the longest-serving World War II fighters in active military service. These extended service lives testified to the aircraft's fundamental soundness and operational reliability. The human cost of Pacific air combat made the Hellcat's protective features as important as its performance. Self-sealing fuel tanks prevented fires that had killed countless pilots in earlier fighters. Armor plating behind the pilot seat stopped bullets and shrapnel that would have been fatal wounds. The robust structure meant damaged Hellcats returned to carriers when other fighters would have gone into the ocean. Navy statistics showed that Hellcat pilots had significantly higher survival rates than pilots of any previous carrier fighter, and survival meant experienced pilots flew multiple combat tours, further multiplying American tactical advantages. Japanese pilots who survived the war acknowledged the Hellcat's impact in post-war interviews. Saburo Sakai, who lived to become one of Japan's most famous aces, stated that the Hellcat's introduction marked the turning point in Pacific air combat. Other Japanese veterans described the psychological impact of facing an opponent that controlled engagement terms completely. The warrior culture that had sustained Japanese military effectiveness for decades couldn't overcome fundamental material disadvantage, and the Hellcat represented that disadvantage in its most concentrated form. The F6F Hellcat's legacy isn't just in the statistics or the technological achievements, it's in the fundamental shift it created in aerial warfare doctrine. Before the Hellcat, dogfighting meant turning combat, close-range maneuvering contests, where the most agile aircraft generally won. After the Hellcat, dogfighting meant energy management, vertical tactics, and systematic exploitation of power to weight advantages. That doctrinal revolution shaped jet-age air combat and continues influencing fighter tactics into the 21st century. The Japanese radio intercepts that warned pilots to avoid vertical combat with Hellcats represented more than tactical adjustments. They revealed a fundamental psychological collapse. For 2 years, Japanese pilots had approached combat with confidence built on technical superiority. Now, their own commanders were telling them to avoid specific types of engagement with specific American aircraft. That acknowledgement of inferiority, transmitted over combat frequencies for American intelligence to intercept and translate, marked the moment when Japanese naval aviation understood it had lost not just battles, but the technological and tactical initiative that victories required. The Hellcat didn't just win the Pacific Air War through superior climb rate. It changed forever how air superiority fighters are designed, flown, and employed in combat. The vertical dimension became the battlefield, and American pilots controlled it absolutely. That's the real victory, and it's the one that echoes through every fighter cockpit to this day. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.